A raven took over Shadow's nest, then Kaydee did something interesting. For weeks, almost every new development in Big Bear has focused on two eagles, Shadow and Kaydee. We have watched Kaydee return to the same trees. We have watched her investigate the nest. We have heard her vocalize around Shadow. And little by little, a young eagle who once looked like a temporary visitor has begun moving through Big Bear with increasing familiarity. But recently, something different appeared in the story. Not another eagle, a raven. At first, that might not sound important. Ravens have always been part of the Big Bear landscape. They fly through the territory, investigate food, approach the nest, and sometimes seem almost impossible to ignore. But this time, the timing made the encounter interesting. The raven appeared around Shadow's nesting area. Then Kaydee arrived, and soon afterward she began calling. That sequence immediately raises a tempting question. Was Kaydee reacting to the raven? And if she was, why did the presence of another bird around this particular nest matter to her at all? It would be easy to jump to the most dramatic explanation. Kaydee was defending Shadow's nest. Kaydee wanted Shadow to help. Kaydee already sees the nest as her territory, but none of those conclusions can be proven from one encounter. The real story is subtler. Because the raven may not be the most important animal in this moment, Kaydee's response may be. And if we place that response beside everything she has been doing over the past several weeks, a much larger question begins to emerge. At what point does a visiting eagle stop merely investigating a territory and begin behaving as though the territory matters? To understand that, we first need to look at the nest itself. For years, the Big Bear nest was inseparable from Jackie and Shadow. They built there, they laid eggs there, they raised eaglets there. They defended the surrounding territory, and millions of viewers came to recognize nearly every branch. But to the animals flying through Big Bear, the nest is not a monument. It is a resource, a large, established structure high in a mature tree, something that can be investigated, something that may attract attention, and not only from eagles. Ravens are intelligent. Opportunistic birds, they notice food. They explore nests. They take advantage of opportunities. They can appear around eagle territories, even when the resident eagles are somewhere else. So the presence of a raven near Shadow's nest by itself is not extraordinary. The interesting part is what happened next. Kaydee appeared, and instead of the raven being just another background bird in Big Bear, the encounter suddenly became part of Kaydee's growing story. Because this was not Kaydee's first time around the nest, she already knew where it was. She had visited before. She had moved through it. She had examined the structure. She had returned to familiar locations around it. And now another animal was occupying part of that same space. That changes the context, not necessarily the meaning, but the context. And in wildlife behavior, context is everything. Imagine the same encounter happening several weeks earlier. A young eagle arrives in Big Bear for the first time. A raven is near the nest. The young eagle calls. We would have very little reason to interpret the moment as anything more than a normal interaction between wild birds. But Kaydee is no longer completely unfamiliar with this territory. She has history here now. A short history, but history nonetheless. She has shared trees with Shadow. She has investigated the nest. She has used familiar roosting areas. She has participated in vocal exchanges. She has repeatedly returned after having every opportunity to continue exploring somewhere else. That means each new behavior can now be compared with what came before. And comparison is what turns isolated observations into patterns. So the question is not, did Kaydee defend the nest from a raven? We cannot say that. The better question is, did Kaydee respond differently because this was a place she had already begun to recognize? That is much harder to answer, and much more interesting. To understand why, it helps to think about familiarity. When an eagle first enters a new landscape, almost everything is unknown. Where is food? Where are the best perches? Which areas are occupied? Where can the bird rest? Which other animals are present? Where is the nest? As that eagle returns, uncertainty decreases. The landscape becomes a map. One tree connects to another, A roost connects to a lookout connects to the lake connects to feeding opportunities, and eventually, locations begin to acquire meaning. Kaydee seems to be moving through that process now. She no longer appears to discover the big bear nest by accident. She knows where it is. That does not mean she owns it. It does not mean she intends to use it for breeding. But familiarity changes how an animal can respond to events around a location. And that may be what makes the raven encounter worth watching. There is another important detail. Kaydee is approaching adulthood. She is not a newly fledged eaglet wandering without experience. She can hunt. She can travel long distances. She can evaluate habitat. And at this stage of life, territory may eventually become increasingly important. That does not mean every nest she investigates is a future home. Young eagles can explore many suitable places before settling. But a large established nest inside productive habitat would naturally be worth examining. Big Bear offers a lake, fish, large trees, safe perches, and an established resident eagle. From a biological perspective, there are plenty of reasons for Kaydee to continue returning. The challenge is determining which of those reasons matters most. Maybe the nest interests her. Maybe shadow interests her. Maybe the entire territory does. Maybe all three are becoming connected, and the raven may have accidentally given us a way to ask a better question. When another animal appears near something an eagle values, behavior can change. But the key word is values. We cannot see value directly. We infer it through repeated behavior. An eagle returns to a perch. Again and again. That suggests the perch is useful. An eagle returns to a feeding area. Again and again. That suggests the food resource matters. An eagle repeatedly spends time around a nest. Over time, that nest becomes worth paying closer attention to. But one reaction still does not prove territorial attachment. That is why Kaydee's future behavior matters more than this single raven encounter. If another raven appears tomorrow, what does she do? If a raven lands directly in the nest, does Kaydee react? If shadow is absent, does her behavior change? If shadow is present, does she respond differently? Does she call? Does she approach? Does she ignore it? Those repeated comparisons would tell us much more than one exciting moment. Ravens themselves make this especially interesting. They are not passive background animals. They are curious, bold, highly intelligent, and they can be persistent around larger birds. In many eagle territories, ravens may fly nearby, vocalize, investigate food, or appear around nesting areas. Sometimes the larger eagle ignores them. Sometimes interactions become more intense. Sometimes the raven seems almost deliberately irritating. But assigning motive is difficult. What looks like teasing to us may simply be ordinary opportunistic behavior. That same caution applies to Kaydee if she called after seeing a raven. We cannot immediately translate that call into shadow, come defend the nest. Wild eagle vocalizations can occur in many contexts. Presence, alert, excitement, social communication. Territorial interactions. And without knowing exactly what the call meant, the safest interpretation is simple. Something was happening around the nest. Kaydee was present, and Kaydee vocalized. Everything beyond that needs evidence. But sometimes those three facts are enough to create a fascinating mystery. There is also the shadow question. If Kaydee was calling while a raven occupied the nest area, was Shadow nearby? Could he hear her? Would he respond? This immediately connects the raven's story to everything we have already observed between the two eagles. Shadow and Kaydee have exchanged calls. They have spent extended periods in the same areas. Kaydee has followed him between familiar trees. They have occupied the same roosting zones, so when Kaydee vocalizes during an unusual moment, viewers naturally wonder whether Shadow is part of the communication. Again, we must resist turning that possibility into certainty. But imagine future encounters. A raven arrives. Kaydee calls. Shadow answers. Shadow approaches. Now we have a sequence. If that sequence happens once, it is interesting. If it happens repeatedly, it becomes evidence. And if both eagles eventually respond to activity around the same nest, the entire story begins to look different. Not necessarily romantic. Not necessarily a confirmed pair, but potentially coordinated. And coordination is much more informative than proximity alone. So far, the Kaydee and Shadow story has largely been about closeness. How often is Kaydee near Shadow? How close do they perch? How often does she return? Do they call to one another? Those observations matter. But the next stage of the story may be about shared responses. Do they react to the same events? Do they react to the same birds? Do they show interest in the same nest? Do they remain in the same areas when something changes? That is why a raven can become surprisingly useful. Not because the raven itself is extraordinary, but because it creates pressure. And pressure reveals behavior that calm conditions may never show. Imagine a completely quiet afternoon. Kaydee sits near the nest. Shadow is in a nearby tree. Nothing happens. We learn they can occupy the same territory peacefully. Now introduce a raven. The raven lands near the nest. Suddenly, both eagles have decisions to make. Ignore it, watch it, call, approach, leave. Those decisions provide new information. And the same principle applies if the visitor is another eagle, a hawk, a raven, any animal entering an area they use. Calm conditions reveal tolerance. Disruption can reveal priorities. That may be why the raven's story matters. But there is another interpretation we should not ignore. What if Kaydee simply does not care about the nest? What if her vocalization had nothing to do with the raven? Those possibilities are equally important. Wildlife storytelling becomes unreliable when every new observation is forced to fit the story we already want. Maybe Kaydee arrived because she was looking for Shadow. Maybe she called because she normally vocalizes there. Maybe the raven happened to be present at the same time. Coincidence is always possible. That is why the most responsible response is not to declare an answer. It is to design the next question. And in this case, the next question is obvious. Will Kaydee react the same way the next time another bird occupies the nest? That is something cameras can potentially show. The more frequently Kaydee returns, the easier that question becomes to study. A temporary visitor does not provide much data. A recurring visitor does. Every day creates another comparison, and Kaydee is now giving observers exactly that opportunity. She visits, she leaves, she returns, she uses familiar trees, she checks the nest. She calls, she spends time near Shadow. Then another day begins. This repetition is slowly transforming the way we can understand her behavior. At first, everything she did was new. Now, we are beginning to recognize what looks normal for Kaydee in Big Bear. And once you know the normal pattern, unusual behavior becomes much easier to detect. That may be the real significance of this raven encounter. Not that it proves Kaydee defended anything. It does not. But it gives us the first version of a new experiment. What happens when something interrupts Kaydee's routine so far? Her routine seems increasingly connected to Big Bear. If that routine becomes stronger over the coming weeks, disruptions may tell us what she values most. Shadow? The nest? The territory? Food? A specific perch? We may eventually discover that one of those matters much more than the others, and perhaps the answer will surprise us. For viewers, there is also an emotional reason the nest feels important. There's Jackie. The Big Bear community spent years watching Jackie and Shadow occupy this space. Every new animal inside the nest now carries an emotional weight that may not exist for the animals themselves. When a raven appears there, some viewers may immediately see an intruder. When Kaydee appears afterward, it may feel like she is stepping into a role, but nature does not recognize those human roles. Kaydee does not need to replace Jackie. The raven is not disrespecting a memorial. Shadow is not acting inside a story written for an audience. They are wild animals responding to habitat. There's opportunity, social signals, and survival. That does not make the story less emotional. It makes it more fascinating. Because instead of assigning meaning, we get to discover meaning slowly through behavior. And Kaydee may now be giving us enough repeated behavior to begin asking much better questions. A few weeks ago, who is this eagle? Then, why does she keep returning? Then, why does she keep following Shadow? Then, why does she keep checking the nest? And now, what happens when something else occupies that nest? Notice how every question has become more specific. That is what happens when a wildlife story develops in real time. We do not move from mystery to answer. We move from mystery to better mystery. And the Raven may have given us the best one yet. There is another scenario worth imagining. Suppose Kaydee continues returning as the seasons move closer to breeding activity. She spends more time around the nest. Shadow spends more time there, too. Then ravens appear again. Would both eagles respond? Would Shadow become more territorial? Would Kaydee remain instead of leaving? If coordinated nest activity eventually begins, the meaning of those responses could change dramatically. A raven in August may be little more than another bird around a familiar tree. The same raven during active nest preparation could be treated very differently. Timing matters. Context matters. Season matters. That is why whatever happens now should be treated as a baseline. We are learning what Kaydee does before the next breeding season begins. Later, we will have something to compare. There is also the possibility that Kaydee leaves before then. And if she does, this entire raven encounter may eventually look like a tiny footnote in the story of a traveling young eagle. That would not make the observation meaningless. It would remind us how dangerous it is to turn temporary patterns into permanent conclusions. Kaydee still has choices. Big Bear may be only one stop in a much larger journey. She can leave tomorrow. She can disappear for weeks. She can explore another lake. That uncertainty is part of the story, and it is why we should not say she owns this nest. Not yet. But the more often she returns, the more interesting the question becomes. Perhaps the most revealing detail is simply that Kaydee notices what happens here. An unfamiliar landscape can be passed through without much investment. A familiar landscape produces expectations. You know which tree should be empty, which bird is normally there, where the resident eagle usually sits, which nest belongs in the center of your movements. If Kaydee is beginning to recognize those patterns, then a raven sitting somewhere unexpected may stand out. Again, we cannot know that from one event, but this is exactly what future footage can test. And that is the difference between speculation and observation. Speculation says Kaydee defended the nest. Observation says a raven appeared around the nest. Kaydee arrived. Kaydee vocalized. Now we watch what happens next time. The second version is less dramatic, but in the long run, it is much more powerful. Because if the pattern repeats, viewers will not need to invent a conclusion. The behavior will begin revealing one itself. Shadow may also become the key. If Kaydee calls around nest disturbances consistently bring Shadow into the same area, that would be worth documenting. If Shadow ignores those events, that matters too. If Kaydee eventually responds alone, that tells another story. Every possibility moves us closer to understanding whether she is primarily interested in Shadow or Big Bear itself. Perhaps the Raven has exposed that distinction. If Kaydee only reacts when Shadow is present, maybe the social relationship is the stronger clue. If she begins reacting around the nest even when Shadow is nowhere nearby, the territory itself may deserve more attention. That is a fascinating question, and one we could not even ask when Kaydee first arrived. For now, the answer remains open. The Raven came. Kaydee appeared. Kaydee called. That is what we know. But because of everything that happened before it, those simple events are no longer isolated. They belong to a larger timeline. Kaydee found Big Bear. She returned. She learned the familiar trees. She investigated the nest. She followed Shadow. She participated in vocal exchanges. She stayed around the territory. And now, another animal has entered a place she already knows. The question is no longer whether Kaydee recognizes Shadow's nest. She clearly knows where it is. The question is whether that recognition has begun to mean anything more. So the next time a raven lands near the nest, watch Kaydee. Does she ignore it? Does she approach? Does she call? Does Shadow answer? Does Kaydee stay after the raven leaves? And most importantly, does the same pattern happen again? Because if it does, the raven may have accidentally revealed something larger than anyone expected. Not a battle, not ownership, not proof of a new pair, something quieter. A young eagle beginning to care about what happens inside a place she once only visited. And that possibility leads to an even bigger mystery. Kaydee has already shown us that she knows where Shadow's nest is. The next question is whether one day she may begin treating it as a nest that matters to her too.